Daniel Montgomery, Mike Cosper, thanks for sitting down today and having a little chat about your new book, Faithmapping. Daniel, you start the book by telling a little bit of your own story at Sojourn and being here at Southern Seminary. Maybe just tell us a little bit about the genesis of this project and your own story.
Yeah, I think evangelicalism in general, I was 24 when Sojourn started, and I was a patriarch in the community because I was 24 and married, and the average age was 19. But we didn't really come out of a tradition, and I find myself in the evangelical culture at large was really an experience of being lost, and in the sense of I wasn't really able to make the connections between the gospel, church, and world. I more or less emphasized a reformed substitutionary atonement understanding of the gospel. I knew church was important because around the year 2000 there was a lot of emphasis on community, being a window into the gospel, Stanley Grins and the Young Leadership Network. There was just a big emphasis on church. But the connection between gospel and church wasn't really being made. And then add to that the missional renaissance that was emerging then. But there were more or less three compartments for me. There wasn't integration. And so I constantly found myself going between these three worlds and unable to really make the connections.
It's something you see a lot of where in ministry we're tempted to sort of say the church is all about this, or the church is all about that, or the church is all about mission, or the church is all about community. And it's hard to see those kind of it's hard to see how those things kind of plug into one another and fit together. And so we really wrestled with it over the years of the early years of life at Sojourn.
And you were there from the beginning, right?
I was 19 years old, right there in the average age, serving as a pastor of worship fairly early on. As we wrestled through things, we really, by God's grace, through a variety of sort of personal experiences, conversations, that kind of thing, we really came to fall in love with the gospel. And we saw, the way that the gospel holds those three worlds together: gospel, church, and mission. And that's kind of given shape to the whole project.
Tell us a little bit about the title, Faithmapping, because people aren't going to be familiar with what that means. And you talk in the introduction about GPS versus maps and being lost. What's the significance of the title, and how does that inform the book?
I think it comes a lot from the story. We really did have this sense of where are we? What are we supposed to be doing here? And so the idea of faith mapping is, all right, let's just take these things, take these components of what it means to be a Christian, to be the church, and let's just sort of lay them out on the table and understand the broader picture. If you take somebody and you drop them off from a helicopter out in the middle of the wilderness, and they have no map and they have no idea where they are, they're probably in trouble, unless you're Bear Grylls or somebody like that. And so the whole idea of maps is to say, what's our sense of place? What's our sense of belonging? What does it mean to be a Christian in the world? And where am I going? Where am I journeying? Where am I at in terms of a broader perspective on the whole gospel, the whole church, the whole world?
Yeah, really the essence of faith mapping is making the connections between the whole gospel, God's kingdom, life with God that is available to us through the work of Christ, and it's totally by grace, and that forms and fuels the whole church, and that is to be lived out in the whole world. And typically what people like to do is they like to emphasize one aspect, one fragment of the map, and say it's all about this neighborhood. And what we're saying is it's a far bigger gospel, it's a far bigger understanding of church, and it's a far bigger world that God's calling us to engage.
So you're talking about the fragmentation of the map, the evangelical map and evangelical faith. Tell us a little bit about the gospel, because you guys don't just define the gospel one way, but you look at it through three perspectives, three angles. Unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, when we speak of the gospel, whole gospel, it's one gospel, three parts. And so it's God's kingdom, life with God under the rule of God, the gospel of God's cross, which is the total salvation Christ has achieved for us in his life, death, and resurrection, and the gospel of God's grace. And that's the good news of our wonderful acceptance, not because we've earned it or deserved it or are entitled to it, but because God gives it freely at Christ's expense. Typically, people like to camp out on one aspect of the gospel, one part of the gospel. And so you have the kingdom tribe. It's all about life with God and the manifest reign and rule of God, the already not yet. And their big thing is engagement in the world, getting the gospel out, being an agent's transformation in the world. And then you have the gospel of God's cross. And the emphasis there is really getting it right oftentimes. It's a very atonement-centered understanding of the gospel, very focused on the substitutionary work of Christ on our behalf. And that tribe really emphasizes where they stand theologically, crossing the T's, dotting the theological I's, oftentimes in contrast to those who don't. And then finally, you have the gospel of God's grace people. And, labels always hinder thinking at times, but they can be helpful as well. And the gospel of God's grace really emphasized the devotional aspect of the gospel, the fact that we're not just to get it out and get it right, but we're to get it in, we're to live it out. But what happens is when you emphasize one aspect, when you overly emphasize one aspect to the exclusion of the others, it really weakens the impact of the gospel. And we believe a holistic understanding of the gospel brings balance, not only to our theological confession, but actually a theologically driven approach to doing ministry. It brings balance to preaching, it brings unity, and hopefully we can put off some of that sectarian spirit that is so much a part of our history in evangelicalism.
So Mike, talk a little bit about the church, because you have the three aspects of the gospel, but then you also talk about the 5 identities of the church, of being a disciple of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're trying to talk about when we talk about the identities is that the gospel transforms us and makes us into a new person. It gives us a new identities. And so we are, because of the gospel, we're now worshipers, we're now families, we're now servants, we're now disciples, and we're witnesses. And these are realities that are not, a choice we have to wake up and make necessarily. It's what the gospel has done, and what the invitation of the gospel is, that now, because of our redemption, we're now free to live into these things. Apart from the gospel, we couldn't worship. There was no right worship. There was no way that we could truly, genuinely, lovingly serve. We were abandoned. We were orphans, and we couldn't know God, and we certainly couldn't witness to Him because we were lost from Him. So the whole point of identities is to say the gospel transforms us. It invades our hearts. It makes us into this new person. And now it gives us this grand invitation to live these things out together in community.
So often our identities as a church are divorced from the gospel. And so it really, when the life as the church, our identity as the church is cut off from the gospel, it can actually become a gospel in and of itself. Some churches, it's all about worship. It's all about the experience of worship. And it really becomes the gospel of our emotional experience. For others, it's all about changing the community and serving in the world, and it subtly becomes the gospel of service and activism. And so there's a real need to make those connections between what God has done and who we are, and what we do flows from who we are.
I think witnesses is a great sort of case study in it as well, because when you're a witness to something, you can't help being a witness. One of the stories we tell in the book is there was an evening where my wife and I were sitting down to dinner, and we used to live in this apartment right above Bardstown Road here in Louisville, and there was a car wash next door, and it was a notorious car wash for crime and everything else. And so we sat down to dinner one night, and all of a sudden we heard gunshots. And I grabbed my wife, and we get down, just thinking, what on earth is going on? We look out the window, and we see a guy running through the parking lot, just spraying bullets. And that was in a sense, that was a transformative experience. I was a witness to that. And from that point forward, there was nothing, you can't undo what's happened once you've witnessed something. You can't wake up one day and say, well, I'm not going to be a witness to that anymore. No, that happened. That's what happens with the gospel. We encounter the gospel, we hear this wonderful news, and now we're a witness to it. And the invitation is to share that testimony, to live out that identity of, you've been transformed, you're a witness now.
There's been a lot of talk lately about what is the mission of the church and debates, and again, going back to the fragmentation thing, there's various sides. You guys talk about there is only one mission of the church, but you see it in 3 different locations. Maybe you could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, we actually define the mission of the church as God's gospel that forms and fuels His church lived out in His world. So there's no mission apart from the gospel. There's no intelligent biblical understanding of mission divorced from what God has done. And so we're at pains in the work to make the connection between mission and gospel. And so mission is the overarching theme of gospel, church, and world, is how the mission is framed in this work.
And then the world has, we kind of break the world out into these various locations in which, we're living our normal lives. There's our location, which is our home, our marriage, our neighborhood, the place that God's put us. There's our vocation, the work that He's called us to. There's recreation, which is more than just recreation, playing, but it's our rest. It's that invitation to rest and Sabbath. There's restoration, which is where there's need. And then there's multiplication, which is where's God sending us on mission? Where is God inviting us to go and be witnesses and see the church multiply across the globe?
So final question, how do you guys envision God using this book? Who's going to pick it up? Is it for pastors? Is it for lay people? Is it small groups? What do you hope God's going to accomplish through it?
What I hope is to bring some clarity to the confusion that plagues so many churches. Each church is at the mercy of the pastor's sermon series and the next round of books that come out that the pastor or small groups emphasize. And out of that sense of clarity, because there's not clarity, there's confusion. And into that confusion, there's all sorts of evangelical fads. And some of them are theological in nature, and some of them are methodological. So at times, preachers will say, if we could just get expositional preaching and a plurality of elders, then the kingdom of God would usher in. And others will say, no, it's all about being missional, whatever that means. Or we need to decode postmodern culture. And so everyone always has an answer. But what we hope is to move beyond the fads to really the fundamentals of the faith. And 3 parts of the gospel, 5 identities of the church, and 5 dimensions of the world might seem complicated. But at its essence, we're saying, no, these are the fundamentals. And in every endeavor, whether it be business or sports or doing church, there are certain fundamentals we never move beyond. But unfortunately, because of the division that so often marks evangelicalism, people step in with their fads and all their hype. And so what we're hoping is to bring some clarity, some sobriety as well, and hopefully some unity to doing church. This is our desire at a local level, where we have a lot of ministries of mercy and aggressive preaching and worship arts and really engaging the community. And we want our ministers to be aligned around a whole gospel and them being the church in the world.
Yeah, I think a lot about sort of the confused Christian and exactly what he's describing here. Just this image of a person who was my own story. Of reading this book and then that book and saying, okay, it's all about the kingdom, or it's all about grace, or it's all about service, it's all about mission, and I just think about that person, and I would hope that they would read Faithmapping and have a sense, of like, oh, it's a big picture, it's a big story. There's a reason why the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are these narratives, and narratives are multidimensional, and they're and so the good news comes to us, and it's a big invitation. It's a big story. I would hope that Faithmapping helps people to kind of see the breadth of that and give them a sense of peace about this is where God's put me, and this is what God's calling me to, and I can enjoy, I can embrace. Our goal is not to be negative about folks who might emphasize one aspect of the gospel over the others, because in fact those people are extremely helpful. They're helpful to us. They've been formational to us in processing all of this. My goal is to say, and go there, read those things, embrace that, but see it as a part of this whole that is the good news that Jesus has given to us.